The princess rode over a knoll and raced around the trees. She negotiated between the forks almost thoughtlessly. Terracon mounted and followed. "Whoa, Cassandra!" Terracon said, not wanting to yell. "Osmara is the other way." "Why did you not wait for me in Runa? It would have been easier on you," Cassandra shouted back over her shoulder. Terracon struggled to catch up. "What?" Cassandra repeated her question. "Wait for you in Runa?" "It is a shame the others did not hear this," Terracon said, laughing. "I could not just wait for you. Imagine what would happen if you did not come back." Cassandra was glowing. "I always come back." "Yes, after we wrangle, tether, and bring you back," Terracon retorted. "Well, I would come back if the lot of you would leave me alone and give me the chance to return." "Really? Out of curiosity, from where would you be returning?" Cassandra was half tempted to tell him. She would not necessarily be upset if Terracon happened to sneak up on her while she was wandering around the ruins of Domara alone. "Anywhere. Do you think I have one little hole where I keep burying myself?" She frowned. "I'll do anything to escape that castle right now." "Well then, will you at least tell me where you escaped to this time?" He really did not need to know why she ran. She was always running. Should she tell him? Perhaps it would be better to keep him guessing. "Oh, to the same place you're always escaping," she said, smiling. This might still work out to her advantage. Consideration furrowed Terracon's brow. "Wait a second. Do not think for a moment that I do not see that this is a trick. You are either going to crack some joke about me retreating, or you're going to find one of my hiding places to make my life more," he wanted to say miserable, "complicated." Cassandra hummed contemplatively. "Although that is a good idea, this time, alas, I'm serious." "And to where does Her Royal Highness suggest that I retreat?" "Into a book," Cassandra arched an eyebrow accusingly. She slowed Ramses. "I see how you sit in the back of the throne room clutching that book." Terracon flushed with embarrassment and ducked his eyes. That was not the reaction Cassandra wanted. "You know, you never read me those stories anymore," she added in a humble tone. Terracon looked up, surprised. "Well, it is just that I miss you coming by at night and reading to me about the wars of Thresha and the seductions at the Judician Seraglio." "Well, do you want to borrow the book?" Terracon offered. Cassandra shrugged dismissively and sought another topic. The trail ahead tumbled down a hill and meandered past a broad pool. "Hey, we are here." She rushed down to where the worn path traced the curve of the pond's muddy shore. Rays of sunlight filtered through the break in the canopy over the water and shimmered on the pool's surface. Drooping willows swept up ripples. The long, limp branches were tangled in the murky depths. The erosive lapping had raised the embankments on the pond's far side into a steep, sheer cliff. Cassandra dismounted and pushed Ramses off to one side. She fiddled with the frog on her cloak and threw it over the unicorn. Ramses, too busy foraging, paid no mind. "Come on, a swim will be refreshing." She knelt down, unlatched the golden braces, and slipped out of her boots. "You must be joking," Terracon scoffed. Cassandra ignored him. The lacing of her corset hissed as it slipped through the loops. Terracon's eyes followed the princess's dress as it dropped to the grass. Instinctively, his gaze focused on her garter, a belt of chocolate leather that strapped the middle of her thigh and was faceted with segments of golden filigree. A leafy vine, crafted from jade sheared so thin that it was almost translucent, was set in the panels of scrolling gold. Contrary to the rumors which had spread through the castle, Terracon had never before so much as accidentally laid eyes on her garter, much less have it exposed to him in broad daylight. She noticed his gawking and laughed. Terracon immediately averted his gaze and sank into deeper and deeper shades of embarrassment. Wearing only her most minimal undergarments, Cassandra waded in waist deep, then dove under. Terracon heard the splash, knew that she was in, knew that he was free again to look. He dismounted, leaned against his unicorn, and waited. Ripples slipped across the water as she surfaced. Her hair was draped in sopping tendrils around her face. She heard him chuckle, and she slunk back to the embankment to inquire, "What is so funny?" "You, expecting me to get in the water." "What is the matter? Are you scared?" Cassandra sneered, then quipped condescendingly. My mother was right to call you demure. No, she did not. Also, your lies are becoming obvious. Now, I am on duty. I cannot take off for a swim. I'm supposed to get you back to Osmara. We do not have time for this, so let us go. Cassandra stood up, crossed her arms in mocking, and tested. Why? Terracon loved the glint in her purple eyes, how the facets of her irises fired with impulsive passions. Her staunch and glower could not move him, though. Their stares wrestled for a long time before Cassandra relented. She sighed in defeat and whined, Come on, have some fun. We need to get back to Osmara. Cassandra turned away as soon as he said anything other than yes, and huffed and dove under before he could even finish his sentence. She wanted to play, but he did not. If he wanted to wait, she would let him. She could abandon his interests as easily as he could abandon hers. Currents of cold water curled out of her wake. Terracon let his mount forage with Ramses as he meandered to the edge of the embankment where a fallen tree waded its branches in the shallow waters. He found a comfortable seat on the tripped trunk, waited, and let his mind wander. He would have to report what had happened, but found he could not begin to explain the day's events. He had no idea where Cassandra had gone. He had stumbled over her path by accident. She did not surface. All previous attempts to find her hideout had been futile. He already knew that determining the location would not be any easier this time. He needed to be firmer with her, but he did not want to be. He agreed that she needed time away, to herself, and would rather suffer his superior's disappointment than betray his resolute sympathy for her. Where was she? Maybe he did not notice her come up. The surface of the water giggled with occasional troublesome bubbles. An anxious surge flooded Terracon. He hopped around on the shore in a struggle to simultaneously wrestle out of his boots and strip off his armor. He peeled off his breastplate, kicked off his second boot, slunk out of his chainmail, and dove into the water. The shock from crashing into the cold was cancelled out by the hot frenzy beating through his veins. The muscles in his throat burned as they cinched back his breath. Rays of sunlight stabbed and streaked through the water, but the clouded, murky depths stung his opened eyes and absorbed any detail which might have helped him discern where Cassandra had gone. Terracon pulled and kicked into ever deeper, ever colder, ever darker waters, until his hand swept through a depth too black to see and so cold it numbed. His fingers raked back, empty. Terracon's throat gave out. His chest collapsed, and a breath of bubbles raced to the water's wavering, light-stabbed ceiling. Terracon beat against the depths, scaled with the bubbles through the progressively warmer waters back to the surface. His linen tunic dragged in his wake, his loose sleeves tangled and twisted as he wrestled to ascend. He stretched a hand out of the water, but the air was too thin to make a firm grip. His mouth was already open. He was already pulling in a breath when he broke over the surface. Flailing kicks beached him gagging, coughing and spitting up the water that inundated his lungs. He wrenched himself onto his knees and heaved and gasped. Silt was clenched between his fingers and scraped beneath his toes. He caught his breath, then turned to sit on his hip and survey the waters. Other than the wake of his desperate escape breaking against the embankment, nothing had changed. There was still no sign of her. He dove in again, splashed about, rummaged through the water for her, but found nothing, found only himself surrounded by emptiness. Paranoia coiled cold around him, choked him like the water did, drew him deeper into the abyss. He strained to reach ever further, but his hands were always empty. He could reach forever in every direction and never find anything. He stood back up. "What is it?" Cassandra asked a short distance from him. Terracon's face twisted from fear, through confusion to rage. "Where were you?" he barked. Cassandra rolled her eyes. She flicked water at him to cool his temper. "Come on," she grudgingly commanded. Terracon peeled out of his sopping tunic and leather trousers, threw them to shore, then followed her under the water. Terracon's breath stayed with him longer. Knowing Cassandra was alive loosened Paranoia's choking coil. He lost sight of her in the cloudy water and had to follow her descent by the wake of her kicks. Details of her began to sift visibly through the murk. She had slowed by the steep embankment, was tracing her hands against the rocks, pawed and fondled for something, then was suddenly gone, lost to the darkness. Terracon ached to surface for a fresh breath, but was grabbed at the wrist by Cassandra. Her touch convinced him to stay. She dragged him down through a tangle of branches and roots and into a cave. The pond water had been warm at the surface, and a slow descent had given their bodies a chance to adjust to the ever chillier depths. Inside the cave, however, the water was icy. Blind in the darkness, they had to grope the rock walls for a route. Their hands, however, were too numb from the cold to discern the jagged texture. The chill sipped the heat from their bodies, taxed them of every reserve. Terracon crashed into Cassandra. She had stopped. They were at the end of the tunnel. Too deep for a fresh breath and too late to turn back, Terracon's breath was belching out of him. Frantically he patted the walls for an escape, but numb fingers could only discern that they were enclosed. Paranoia's cold coil again slithered shut around him. Cassandra drew her arms out to embrace him. She pulled him into her ascent. The roof of the cave was higher than Terracon expected. They floated up and broke suddenly over the water's surface into a pocket of air. The darkness was absolute. Only the echoes of their gasps and the resounding wake of their surfacing hinted at the dimensions of the cavern's vault. "Where are we?" Terracon asked. He could not see Cassandra, but could hear her loud breathing. "This is my well." Cassandra summoned a bubble of light and let it float. Its radiance was initially drowned dim by the depths, but the cavern's dome shimmered ever brighter as the luminous dollop surfaced. Light reflected off of the rippling water to scrawl a wavering aquatic argyle across the cavern's dome. The washing pattern hypnotized them. They marveled. "Is it not beautiful?" Terracon did not answer. "I found it quite a few years ago and just started coming here when I wanted to be by myself. I swear, one time, when I was ready to go home, I surfaced and saw something hovering over the water. I think it was a water sprite. I was so afraid that it would notice me that I dove right back under and hid here until I could not stand the cold any longer." "This is where you went?" Terracon shouted, but the volume of his echo made him regret his tone. More sensitive to his surroundings, he continued in a whisper. "You sent the entire castle into an uproar." "I know," she said, smiling. "That is why I wanted to come back." Terracon's outrage was surfacing again. Cassandra rebuffed his frustration with a roll of her eyes. "Come on, I'm cold." She then sank again into the depths of the cavern. Terracon followed her down through the cold, flooded stone shaft. Cassandra found her footing on the shore and pulled herself up. The sand then suddenly disappeared from beneath her feet. Strong hands had grasped her at the ankle and back. She was lifted up and shivered at being exposed raw to the cool air. Terracon's shoulders rippled as he held her above his head. She squealed helplessly as Terracon pitched her into the water. The water's surface exploded as she fell in. Waves welled up from her impact across the pond. Terracon stealthily slipped back into the water under the cover of the waves. He could give her this moment of play, even if no one else at the castle could afford it. They surfaced together, laughing. Their hysterical giggling slowly calmed, faded to small chuckles, intermittently broken by heavy sighs. "It's getting late," Terracon noted. The cool, glittering water was starting to blush into the same shade of dirty pink as the evening sky. Overhead, where the canopy opened around the pool, they could see the fluffy white clouds catching the last rays of the sun before it sank beyond the horizon. "Not really. Osmara is only an hour from Runa, with a strong shipment of marrows," Cassandra smiled, knowing no expense had been spared to secure her return. Voices approaching through the distance interrupted their intimacy. The princess's illusion seemed to have worn off, and the laughter-strewn cursing suggested that the soldiers had figured out what had happened. Terracon looked off into the forest, and Cassandra noticed his youthful smile fade away. As he turned back, their noses touched. Cassandra looked deep into Terracon's dark eyes. They seemed so tired. Terracon was lost in her gaze, hypnotized by its gemstone luster. She pressed her lips to his. "A kiss?" Terracon realized and pulled away. He held her off at arm's length. Her eyes were closed. He could still feel her lips against his own. A voice burst loud with mocking. "Well, well, I think our mermaid has caught a fish flopping out of the water." Cassandra opened her eyes, awake to and aware of their publicity. Terracon lowered his head shamefully and pulled remorsefully away. Cassandra huffed her disappointment. A devious ingenuity then lifted her mood. She tugged the drawstring on Tarakon's undergarment to rip it clean off of his waist. It sank slowly. Tarakon blushed and flustered. Cassandra dove toward the shore to quickly escape his wrath. She stumbled onto the sandy slope, snatched up her black silk dress, and clutched it close in a desperate attempt to hide her garter from the gathered soldiers' views. Tarakon curled awkwardly in the water in an attempt not to expose himself as he dove to retrieve the sinking garment. Cassandra slipped the black dress over her head and tightened the corset enough only to keep it from slipping. As Tarakon resurfaced, Cassandra stared down at him from her saddle and said, "I must return to the castle without delay. Your flirtatious ways will have to wait." He glared venomously at her from beneath his furrowed brow as he violently knotted the drawstring closed around his waist again. Cassandra laughed as she spurred Ramses into a trot down the trail without an escort. 2 of the knights chased after, hollering vain requests for obedience. "Get up here, lover boy." The sergeant had dismounted and offered his hand. Tarakon accepted the aid, but snarled, "Watch it, Daryl." He had no patience for the rumors which the other soldiers were already considering to publicize.